go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So the idea was today we would just sort of talk a little bit in almost like what an orientation, I think that was the word I put, is Majjhamaka Avatara. So and I just want to say one quick thing. Like, so of course, the reason why I scheduled this one was because Ken Rinpoche is going to be teaching on this text, of course, soon at the center. I feel like I should also preface it by saying I don't really understand the Majjhamaka Avatara. That's why I requested Ken Rinpoche to teach it. So I should, that's just being honest. But I could definitely do a little bit of orientation. So that's different than actually teaching the text, because I don't understand it. So I can do that. But it is reasonable to kind of orient people. So I think a reasonable place to start in terms of orienting is the title, right? So actually, I'll start. So Chandrakirti wrote this text in Sanskrit, the Majjhamaka Avatara. So Lama Tsongkhapa in his commentary begins by, as often commentaries in Tibetan often do, by discussing the title. And so I just thought we could start there, because that's a reasonable place to start in orienting to a text, is its title. So Majjhamaka means middle way, the middle way. And one thing actually that is clarified by Lama Tsongkhapa is, sometimes in English they'll sort of say Majjhamaka like, where it's AKA at the end versus sometimes it's IKA. So I guess in English, at least the way Jeffrey Hopkins did it, when it's IKA, it's the person who follows Majjhamaka philosophy, but in this case it's not referring to the person, it's referring to the middle way itself, the middle way philosophy, or the middle way. And so just starting with that first word, actually that's funny. I could think like, if Lama Zopa Rinpoche were, right, if he were explaining this, he could spend like a week on just the word Majjhamaka, right? Then he would say, I've been in teaching, and not on this text, but I've been in teaching like that, where after a week, Lama Zopa would say, well, we didn't get past the first half of the title's word, or something, But, because the word Majjhamaka is very profound, right, like in terms of what does it mean? So in this context, really, it means the middle way between the two extremes, right? They usually say the extreme of nihilism, which is considered the most negative of views, so it's a terrible mistake to take. Or if you take the philosophical explanations of emptiness as nihilism, that would be the worst mistake you could make from a spiritual perspective. But also, the middle way avoids the other extreme of reification or eternalism, or different ways to say it, right? Or reifying things as existing in some way that's more substantial, or more existing with more from their own side than they actually have, right? So it's a middle way between those two extremes. You're not negating entirely the existence of things, but you're also not reifying or adding something on, right? Some kind of substantial existence, or more subtly, some kind of inherent existence, or existence for its own side that's not there. So they say middle way. One really what middle way means is that, right? This middle way between those two extremes. Then middle way can also refer to a kind of a school of philosophy that that teaches about that was begun ultimately by the Buddha, but as a kind of identifiable tradition of a particular philosophical stance in a way. It was sort of, they sometimes call the trailblazer for that, was Nagarjuna, Arya Nagarjuna. And so then there was this lineage that kind of came down from Arya Nagarjuna, which I'll say more about in a minute. But in this context, Majjhamaka, and so going through different meanings of the word Majjhamaka, the title. In this context, though, what Lama Tsongkhapa says is that in this context, the word Majjhamaka is referring to a text by Lama Tsongkhapa, the title of which is the Majjhamaka Shastra, the Majjhamaka Shastra. So Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, essentially. And so the way that Lama Tsongkhapa kind of explains the title Majjhimaka Avatara is that Chandrakirti was intending it as a supplement to that text. So avatara means supplement in this context, right? So it would be, it's saying, so what it's saying is that Chandrakirti was actually, came later than Nagarjuna, right? And Nagarjuna had already written a text called the Majjhimaka Shastra, the treatise in the middle way. And then Chandrakirti saw the need for a supplementary text that further explained contents that were in Nagarjuna's text. Does that make sense? So he wrote something that kind of supplemented it. There are different reasons why Chandrakirti may have felt, I can't imagine, I mean, I can't assume that I know what Chandrakirti was thinking, but other people have noted that there are some reasons why Chandrakirti may have felt there was a need for a supplement to that text in his time and after. So, and it's this actually, so if you read the treatises of Nagarjuna, actually, about, especially about Majjhimaka, they're incredibly profound but also difficult to understand correctly. And so what they say is that, actually, so I'm going to just talk briefly about the lineage now for a moment. So, because they say that Arya Nagarjuna sort of was this trailblazer, right, who sort of, what's the word, reinvigorated and sort of explained teachings on the perfection of wisdom particularly, and wrote these, he wrote like 6 treatises on reasoning that were particularly explaining emptiness. And then he had a student, Aryadeva, who also wrote some texts, including the famous one is the 400 Verses on the Middle Way. And so they were considered like the, sometimes they're called the father and son, like, because they were like that close in a sense, and also they were the sort of beginners of this particular lineage of explanation. And so then, and so their texts are considered by all followers of the Middle Way to be, what's the word to say, definitive, in a sense? Like, does that make sense? Like, whereas everybody who's a follower of the Middle Way philosophy considers the texts of Nagarjuna and Aryadeva to be these kind of definitive texts. So after the time, though, of Aryadeva, various authors came along who kind of were trying to explain what does Nagarjuna mean, you know, and they explained it in different ways that actually didn't always agree. Does that make sense? This can happen. And probably the 2 most famous of them were, one was Bodhichitta, and he wrote an explanation of Nagarjuna's teachings, and another was this Indian master called Bhavaviveka. And they disagreed, in a sense. Like, actually, Bodhichitta came first, then Bhavaviveka wrote a commentary sort of disagreeing with Bodhichitta and saying, I think he's wrong. And at that point, there began to form, it wasn't yet formal, but it was beginning to form this two which ultimately became almost like, you could say 3 ultimately in a sense, sub-schools of the Majjhimaka philosophical stance, if that makes sense. Bhavaviveka formed what they call the autonomy school. That's the way Jeffrey Hopkins translates that. That's Svatantrika Majjhimaka, so he calls that autonomy sub-school. So there were different kind of positions about what did Nagarjuna mean, and so, and then also the mind-only school arose also, right? Because the second trailblazer, in India they were considered like, they call these 2 trailblazers, Nagarjuna and Asanga. And so Asanga was born then and sort of began another tradition, which was not a Majjhimaka school, sub-school. It wasn't a Majjhimaka philosophy school. It was the mind-only school. So there were many different sort of philosophical views at this point in India. Does that make sense? So Chandrakirti, people would say, looked at that and said, wow, you know, there's like, now there are all these different people sort of saying different views of what the Buddha's intent was, what Nagarjuna's intent was. And in his view, some of them were incorrect. Does that make sense? So he felt there needs to be a supplement to Nagarjuna's text to sort of clarify this is what Nagarjuna meant and not that. And if you read Chandrakirti's text, which is what we're talking about, you can see that he sort of brings up, he'll say, some people say this, or some people say that, or he'll sort of imply that some people say that, and then he'll say why they're incorrect, using reason. And so, in that sense, one of Chandrakirti's contributions was clarifying the intent of Nagarjuna, and after Chandrakirti's time, certainly Tibetans look back and they say they view this kind of one tradition as Nagarjuna to Aryadeva to Buddha Palita to Chandrakirti and so on, as a sub-school of the Madhyamaka called in Sanskrit, it's the Prasangika, which means consequentialists. And so I'll get into more what consequentialists is if you want in a few minutes, but briefly that's the lineage. Does that make sense? So it came down through them. And this is the part I want to then mention. So in Tibet, actually all the Tibetan schools, for the most part, agree that Chandrakirti's way of explaining Nagarjuna's intent is the most profound. That's one thing that's important. And then also, like if you look at all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, they all study this text. It's like if you look at the biographies of certainly Gelugpa masters, but Nyingma and Sakya, Kongbu masters, they all studied the Madhyamaka Avatara. All the great scholars of all the traditions. And in the Gelugpa tradition, this is where I thought it was a little funny when I was talking with Khentrem Shamler saying, oh, maybe we could study this text. Of course, I was aware, and I could see in his face that, in other words, I think, I can't remember how many years, probably, he studied this text as part of his education to become a geshe for years, actually. Like he spent, lamas would spend anywhere from like 3 or 4 up to 7 or 8 years studying, where the main topic was this text. They would supplement it with, they would study this text, and they would read Nagarjuna's text and other commentaries in the context of studying this text. So the idea of studying it for 9 or 10 days seems a little funny in that context, knowing you could study it for years, but obviously that may not be. There wasn't the freedom to sit with Rinpoche for years straight studying it. So. But I guess the point being, really the idea is if you could understand this particular presentation of emptiness, then you have a correct understanding of emptiness. Makes sense? That's the idea. I remember that actually, Kirti Senjin Rinpoche, many years ago, I was in Boston, and he said, he was just kind of he was teaching on the 3 principal aspects of the path, actually, and he got to the section on emptiness, and he said, he was kind of teaching it, he was teaching it the way lamas often teach it, and then he said, but you won't really understand this subject until you study the Madhyamaka Avatara. It's kind of like, to really understand emptiness, you have to study that text, is what he said. Because it's the most, profound presentation. So that's sort of, so that's just like an introduction to the title. And then I want to make a couple other points. Like, one that's often noted by other people is that, let me jump to that section. Oftentimes, usually, like, they call these shastras in Sanskrit. Like, so, like, there's sutras, right? Sutras are teachings of the Buddha. Does that make sense? That's what like when somebody says a sutra, in the Buddhist context, that means it was something taught by the Buddha. Then a shastra was something taught not by the Buddha himself, but by they say like a great scholar, a great practitioner, somebody who had gained some realization and then wrote a commentary to the Buddha's words. So they actually call this the Madhyamaka Avatara Shastra, right? Because Chandrakirti was a person who could write a shastra. And so usually shastras begin with homage, like homage to the Buddha, or homage to Manjushri, homage to some enlightened being. Chandrakirti's text focuses, there actually is a line in this version that says homage to the youthful Manjushri. But then there's a focus in the early section where he pays homage to compassion. And that's often emphasized, that he makes this focus on compassion at the beginning. Which is interesting, right? Because his text is on, ultimately, the main topic of the text, it's been, most of the volume of the text is focused on emptiness, but he focuses on homage to compassion. Because his view, of course, is that compassion is the most important element of practice. And actually, I'll read the line. He says, homage to compassion. He has a few verses here. It starts like this. Homage to that compassion for migrators, right? Migrators meaning suffering sentient beings who are migrating in samsara. He says, who are powerless like a bucket traveling in a well, through initially adhering to a self, an I, and then generating attachment for things. This is mine. Right? In quotes here. That line is very famous. Like, different ways they kind of say that, but like so compassion for sentient beings who are like a bucket, right? With the buckets are on a pulley, right? Like a kind of pulley system. And actually, let's see if I have that. Yeah, in the commentary, I thought it was interesting. So, first of all, he goes through then other verses, but he actually expresses three types of compassion that he's paying homage to. So the first type is compassion observing sentient beings who are like a bucket in a well. So that's the first type. So you might say, in what way are human beings like a bucket in a well? Right? Like, I don't feel like a bucket in a well. You might think. So in Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary, he lists 6 ways in which we are like a bucket in a well. I'll mention each one. One is a bucket in a well is tied tightly to a rope, right? And he says, just like that, we are tied very tightly to our own mental afflictions and contaminated karma. So we're tied to samsara in that sense, right? And just like the bucket can't untie itself, we're stuck until we free ourselves from samsara. We're tied tightly. Does that make sense? That's one way. A second is where samsara beings in samsara are impelled by the mind to suffer, just like the bucket is controlled by the pulley. Does that make sense? The bucket doesn't have its own control over itself, right? If somebody knocks it into the well, it falls down. If they crank it, it comes back up. So sentient beings are like a bucket in a well in the sense that they're not under their control. They're controlled by their mind, just as the bucket's controlled by the pulley. A third way in which we're in a bucket, or we're like a bucket in a well, is we ceaselessly wander up and down in samsara. Right? So that's the third way in which we're like a bucket in a well. Right? The bucket goes up and goes down and goes up and goes down, and we're just like that, going up and down from the upper realms to the lower realms in samsara. Then about that comes number 4, which is that it's a lot easier to go down than it is to go up. Right? There is if you want the bucket to go down, all you have to do is tap it, right? And it goes, and splashes, right? And once it fills up and you want it to come up, it's a lot of work. And so we're like a bucket in a well, we samsaric beings, in the sense that it's easy and effortlessly we go to the lower realms, and it's only with great effort that we haul ourselves up from the lower realms. Then I won't go into this in too much detail. The 5th one is he actually goes through the 12 links of dependent origination, describing the cycle of samsara, and that's a whole topic. So actually, I listed it on the sheet here, but I don't want to go through all that. But that we cycle in samsara through the 12 links of dependent origination is the 5th point. And the 6th point is that as the bucket is going up and down, seriously, if you're like, if you have like one of those stone well, right? As it's going up and down, the bucket is battered by the 2 sides, or not the 2 sides, right? It's circular, by the sides of the well, or by the stones, right, on the side of the well. And in the same way, we are continually battered by the 3 types of suffering: right? The suffering, the suffering of change, and the all-pervasive suffering of samsara. So just like the bucket is continually sort of beaten up, in a sense, we're beaten up by suffering as long as we're in samsara. So the first point there is Chandrakirti looks at sentient beings and sees, when he looks at us, at ordinary sentient beings, he sees us like that. Does that make sense? And he says, homage to compassion for beings who are suffering in that way. Then, actually, I'll read the next line, because it gets to the second kind of compassion. He pays homage to 3 types of compassion at the beginning. So that's the first type. The second type of compassion is, I'll read the line first. Homage to that compassion for migrators seen as evanescent and empty of inherent, empty of inherent existence, we'll get to in a minute. But evanescent, like a moon in rippling water. So there, what he's saying, they call this one compassion for observing phenomena, which means the first kind is where you say, oh, that's a sentient being, they're suffering. The second kind is that you're observing the mind and the body of sentient beings, right? Which are changing. He gives this a metaphor, right? Changing like if you see the moon on water and there's wind blowing, right? So the moon, there's not a moment of stability, right? The moon is sort of ripples are continually flowing through the image of the moon. And there, what Chandrakirti is describing is he looks at us. You know, we usually grasp at permanence, right? We usually feel some sense of this is me, and I'm stable. Like I'm me. I was me yesterday. I'll be me tomorrow. Right? What he's saying here is there's another kind of compassion where you look at sentient beings, right, and you recognize there is nothing permanent about us suffering sentient beings. Our minds, our aggregates, right? So our minds and our bodies are, they say, don't abide for an instant. Right? There's nothing about us that abides for an instant in some stable, unchanging way. You know, and actually we know that, right? Like, in other words, if you watch your mind, there's not an instant of stability to it. And of course our bodies, whether you look at them whether you look at them from the perspective of biology or you look at them from the perspective of physics, either way, like there's not a millisecond of stability, right? So, like the moon reflected in water, you look at sentient beings, and you recognize, and in one sense, you recognize we are utterly evanescent. That's the word he uses here, the translator uses, and yet are grasping at themselves as permanent. Actually, you want to go on a very slight tangent on that point? Okay. I remember one time I asked Lama Zopa Rinpoche a question. I said, I'd always been curious about this. I'd heard, like, you know, that I'd actually heard this about Lama Zopa Rinpoche himself, a story, but like, actually, well, I'll share it. The story was, Jan Willis told me it, that she was in Nepal with Lama Yeshe, and she was, like, walking with Lama Yeshe, and suddenly, and, you know, she was close with him, and suddenly she heard this, like, wild laughter echoing, like the Himalayas were there, right? And she heard this wild laughter echoing between the Himalayan mountains, and she kind of got, like, was like, you know, like, what's that? And so she turned to Lama Yeshe and said, well, Lama, what's going on? So like that, and Lama Yeshe said, my student, Zopa. And then he kind of pointed, and there was a cave, and the laughter was coming out of this cave, you know. So for years I thought, what's he laughing about? You know, he was in a cave, right? I wanted to know. So one day, I knew he wouldn't answer if I said, Rinpoche, what were you laughing about? No, so Rinpoche would just not, would never answer. So I said, what do yogis sometimes laugh about in caves? And I was surprised he answered, but this is part of his answer relates to this line. He said, you know, the yogi in the cave sees that one. He was giving various levels. He said, he was saying, like, so one point he made was, he said, yogis in the cave see that everything is evanescent and changing in each instant, and yet when he looks around he looks down from the cave at all the sentient beings, they're always grasping at things as permanent. And so they suffer. And then he made other points, like, then he sees that self-centeredness, by being self-centered, beings only have unbelievable misery. They're trying to find happiness by being self-centered, and all they find is this, like, unending suffering. And they keep thinking, I'm going to get happy by doing this, and they keep suffering. And they said, and then, like, sentient beings grasp at a truly existent self where there's no self there. Right? And because they keep grasping at it, they're always suffering. And he said, so when the yogi sees that, then he either has to cry or laugh, one or the other. That was his answer. So it was related to this point of Chandrakirti's, right? That it's sentient beings are evanescent, right? So it's a different kind of compassion, right? It's a compassion that's not grasping at permanence. Does that make sense? So they have compassion without grasping at a permanent entity that's a sentient being. Can you imagine that, right? So it's a compassion that's, the first one you're actually still, what's the word? You're still holding to ascension being there, right? You're saying this person, and he's saying, I pay homage to that kind of compassion, right? Then he's saying there's another kind of compassion, where the being has deep compassion, but isn't grasping at a permanent entity that they have compassion for, or the self that's compassionate. Right? So can you guess what the third type of compassion is going to be then? So the third type of compassion, actually, I already kind of read it. So it's different. The other one is compassion for for migrators empty of inherent existence. Right. So there is a kind of compassion that understands that sentient beings are empty of inherent existence, right? And has compassion for them because, in part, because that mind recognizes they don't see that they're empty of inherent existence, right? And therefore they suffer. Does that make sense? So it's three different, in a way, levels of profundity of compassion. And so in a sense, one wants to give rise to that third kind of compassion, right? Compassion that's conjoined with the wisdom, understanding, emptiness in that sense. And then I'll make a point here, the explanations of these verses point out that why pay homage to compassion? And there's a point that Chandrakirti, that the commentaries make, which I'll just briefly summarize. There's more to it than this, but is bodhisattvas come from compassion, right? The source of all bodhisattvas is compassion, and no Buddhas arise without first being bodhisattvas. So all the Buddhas come from compassion. Then they point out even the what's it called, like hearers and solitary realizers. Right? They come through the teachings of the Buddha. So they would never arise without compassion. So in other words, what he's getting at is all the spiritual goals that we aim for come from compassion. Compassion is kind of like the foundation for all good things that within samsara and outside samsara. They all come from compassion. And even the Buddha comes from compassion, right? So by paying homage to compassion, in a sense, you're paying homage to the cause of the Buddha. But also the cause of the Bodhisattva and the cause of all good things. So it's quite a deep kind of homage, right, to pay homage to compassion. Actually, I'll pause. Maybe I'll say one more point, and then I'll pause and see if there are questions. Then the text overall, so I gave the title, the kind of homage, and then I just want to give it a kind of a point about the structure of the text, because again, that's interesting. I'll share my own one reflection I personally have about it in a minute. But there are 10. There are 10. They call it. You can say chapters. Here they say the first. The actual way it's translated is the first mind generation, the second mind generation, the third mind generation. But there are 10 sections. I think chapters is the best English word for it. I guess I don't think they would say that. I'm not sure there's an exact correlation to the word chapter, ancient Sanskrit or something. But so each of these 10 chapters that the text is organized around corresponds to one of the 10 bhumis. So bhumi is a Sanskrit word for ground, like ground or level. Like technically, I think it literally means like earth, like ground. But in this context, the underlying implication is like levels, like grounds, or like in the sense of progressive grounds. And so those 10 bhumis, grounds, whatever, are the 10 levels that a bodhisattva traverses, right, goes through on the path to Buddhahood. Does that make sense? So everybody who's going to become a Buddha, or every bodhisattva who's going to become a Buddha, begins actually begin before the first ground. They begin they begin by generating bodhicitta. That's the beginning of the bodhisattva's career to achieve Buddhahood. It's the moment the person actually generates bodhicitta, they've entered they call it the path of accumulation, the beginning of the bodhisattva's journey to Buddhahood. And so they kind of go through the path of accumulation, where they study, contemplate, and meditate, and then they enter the path of preparation, where they, one way they sometimes say, gloss that or kind of imply is that preparing for what? Right? Preparing to see emptiness directly. Preparing to actually realize emptiness in direct, what's it, like nakedly or directly or like that. And so, actually, the beginning point of the path of preparation is the bodhisattva has not only had previously has already generated bodhicitta, and at the path of preparation they've realized the union of calm abiding, meditation, calm abiding, a kind of meditative single-pointed aversion, a kind of single-pointed meditative concentration, where they also have a kind of what's called bliss and pliancy or flexibility. It's kind of very deep capacity for meditation, and they gain special insight. Okay, so then on the path of preparation, they're getting closer and closer. There are 4 levels, sub-levels of the path of preparation, where essentially they're getting closer and closer to realizing emptiness directly. And then there comes a point where the bodhisattva realizes emptiness directly for the first time, and that's when they enter the first bodhisattva ground. Or bhumi, which word should I use? Ground. I'll use ground. So they enter the first bodhisattva ground. And so that's where this text begins, the first bodhisattva ground. And so I just want to kind of explain, because it gets at the structure of the text, and I think it's quite interesting. It has some implications, I think, personally. But so the first bodhisattva ground is called the joyful, which is a nice word, nice description of that ground. And sometimes they say, and the person is, it says it in here, something like that. Of course, the person is joyful because they finally have realized emptiness, right? And so they kind of have the blissful experience of having realized the ultimate nature of reality at that point. Let's try to see if it says that here, but I won't find the right section.
That'd be like perfecting the generosity.
So that was what I was about to go through. So each of the 10 grounds, right? So the first ground, yeah, just saying. So the first ground is called the joyful, and that bodhisattva, they say, like perfects or completes the practice, the perfection of generosity of the first of the 10 perfections, rather. In this context, there are 10 perfections. Sometimes there are 6 listed, and sometimes 10. Here there are 10 listed. So on each of the bodhisattva grounds, and this is how Chandrakirti covers the material, is he describes some of the qualities of a bodhisattva at that level, and then he describes which perfection, or paramita, maybe I'll use the word paramita here, the Sanskrit word, which is often translated as perfection. So which paramita the bodhisattva completes. So on the first ground, called the joyful, the bodhisattva has first realized emptiness directly, and completes the paramita of generosity. And then the bodhisattva goes on to the second ground, called the stainless, where they complete the paramita of ethics. And the third, the shining, where they go on to complete the paramita of patience. And then the radiant, where they complete the perfection of joyous effort, and so on, through the 10 perfections. At the end of the 10th, actually, maybe I'll mention that. So the 10th bhumi is called the clouds of Dharma. And there the bodhisattva completes the paramita of wisdom knowledge, jnana in Sanskrit. It's kind of a transcendental wisdom or something. I don't know how to translate it, but wisdom knowledge seems reasonable. And so when the bodhisattva has completed the 10th ground, they become a Buddha. Does that make sense? So that's the training path of a bodhisattva. So this text follows the structure of the bodhisattva's journey process of transformation from a beginner bodhisattva to a Buddha. Does that make sense? And then also something else is quite notable about the text, so one thing is, it's interesting that Chandrakirti chose to structure his text right around the 10 perfections. Some author, I don't think it's a Tibetan author, but some author that I read, I can't remember who, makes a point which I'm not sure is correct or not, but I'll just share it because I thought it was interesting. You can ask Ken Rinpoche if it's correct, but what this author was saying was that one possible reason to structure the text around the 10 perfections is it helps prevent the reader from falling into nihilism, right? Chandrakirti's main topic that he's going to spend most of the words of the text explaining is emptiness, right? But if you begin with homage to compassion, the root of the path, right, and then you're describing a process of transformation that a bodhisattva is going through in order to go from being a beginner bodhisattva to a Buddha, it's hard to take the rest of to take the second emptiness to mean, oh, nothing exists at all, right? Because, well, we're talking about a process of somebody through compassion transforming into a Buddha, right? And so that author was sort of saying, perhaps part of the reason that Chandrakirti sort of couched his deep explanation of emptiness in the context of the path, in this sense, is that way it makes it harder for a reader to misunderstand and sort of think, oh, it's all nothingness, right? Because it's not all nothingness. Somebody's trying to become a Buddha, right? They're progressing through specific grounds, and they're practicing perfections, right? They're practicing ethics and patience, right? So if they're practicing ethics and patience, that means that means they exist, right? You have to exist if you're being patient. So that's sort of the way the text is structured. Does that make sense? And one more point I'll make about that is, it's interesting though, some of the chapters then, if I call them chapters, are very brief, right? Like there were some of the bhumis, the grounds, and the perfections, Chandrakirti covers very briefly, like in a page. But the sixth ground, which is called the become manifest, is the ground on which the perfection of wisdom, right, the prajna paramita, is perfected. And so the vast majority of the text is actually that chapter. Does that make sense? Covers that one, because that's where he then goes into what is the perfection of wisdom. And then he explains in great detail the meaning of the perfection of wisdom, which is the meaning of the ultimate nature of reality, or the meaning of emptiness. So the sixth chapter is the longest chapter by far. It's longer than all the other chapters combined. Because that's the one where the emphasis is on the bodhisattva. All of them include an explanation of emptiness, but that's the one where the main focus is the perfection of wisdom, which ultimately means the realization of the ultimate nature of reality. So that's the way it's structured. All the bodhisattva grounds are mentioned, and each one has its own section. But the sixth chapter that covers the perfection of wisdom is much, much longer, because that was Chandrakirti's main topic for this text, right, is explaining those teachings. Maybe I'll pause there. There's a lot more to talk about, but I'll just pause. Any questions? I was just a little like, what's the word? Maybe this is a little, we talk about the structure of a text. It's not the way we usually, we're going through Lam we don't usually talk that way, or other topics, but like I said, I don't really understand the text, so all I can do is orient, so that's what I'm trying to do, is orient to the text.
Are we providing a copy of the text for the retreaters?
So yeah, at Kent Rinpoche's teaching, what we're going to do is provide it, based on Tashi and Rinpoche's input, we're going to provide I already got copies of the first 5 chapters, not chapter 6, because that's the longest one yet. Because Kent Rinpoche, I guess the input that he gave to Tashi is that he's going to mainly focus on the introduction in chapter 1, and then from my discussion with Tashi, it seemed reasonable that there's a chance we get through the first 4 or 5 chapters. But the input seemed to be that Rinpoche was not going to teach chapter 6 this year, was sort of Tashi's feedback. He may jump to sections of it and sort of talk about it or not, but Tashi said that Rinpoche's input was to focus on the first 5 chapters for this year, or the first few chapters, I guess was more I chose 5, actually. I think the original input was 2 or 3 even, but I figured safer to make 5. So that was the feedback that Rinpoche and Tashi gave, was that they'll cover the beginning section.
The implication is that he'll return and teach the remainder?
I asked that, and Rinpoche kind of just did that thing that Kent Rinpoche does, where he goes,
You mean the stone face?
I think it partly depends on my impression. What I took away from that was it depends how interested the students appear, because chapter 6 is much more. All the chapters. This is not. I should say that this is not an easy text, right? There's a reason why lamas spend, monks and lamas spend years debating it, right? So it's not an easy text to understand. If it were, they would spend a week studying it. And so I sort of got the feeling from Rinpoche that he was kind of like, oh yeah, he was like, I'll teach that text, but he was sort of like saying, and let's see how the students, how interested the students are, before we decide if we want to go into the sections that are even harder to understand. which I think is quite reasonable. So that was sort of the impression, knowing Rinpoche over the years, that was the impression I got. So in a sense, it's how diligent we are that determines what will happen after this year. But I think it's a possibility if we seem interested.
Dr. Lauren, in the attachment that you sent, there was Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on Chandrakirti, and then the text itself, and then I believe the translation. So,
and then there's also Chandrakirti's auto commentary. He wrote a commentary, his own commentary to this text.
How do you recommend to go about approaching those different texts?
My suggestion would be, if you want to read, first of all, nobody has to read anything if they want to, but and we'll have copies of this, which is just the first 5 chapters of the root text. But if you want to study a bit, it can seem daunting, I think, if you look at the PDFs I sent to people who are on that list. They get who are signed up to come to the retreat. The PDFs are very long, so I think some people would look at them and think, oh, I'm not going to read all that. But remember, Kenshin Rinpoche is saying he's going to focus on the first few chapters. So my suggestion would be, even if you read chapter 1 and 2, for example, this book also has the first few chapters in it, actually 1 through 5 of Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary. And that's not very long, actually. In other words, you can easily read the first 2 or 3 chapters. They're quite brief. So my suggestion would be, if you want to read something, is pick up those texts, but just read the first 2 or 3 up to 1 or 2 or 3 up to the first 5 chapters, and then you don't have to read the section on. The sections that are longest and most difficult to read are chapter 6. So just don't read that for this year anyway. And then if you find the teaching interesting, you can read that for next year if Rinpoche agrees to come back. So that's actually not very much reading, though, to read the first few chapters. It's actually pretty brief. Yeah, any other questions? Otherwise, I'll cover a couple more things.
Can you tell about the third compassion part? Like, first I understand it's like simile of a bucket, and second one like shimmering moon, or in the third one.
I'll go back. Yeah. So the way the actual the way they usually translate the term for that is compassion observing the unapprehendable, which is an interesting phrase, right? Compassion. Actually, it's, I don't know, is that, in English, would that be an oxymoron to say, observing the unapprehendable, right? That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because what's, I won't say more than that. First of all, it's an interesting phrase, right? To observe the unapprehendable. Actually, in the Lama Tsongkhapa's, there's a way that in the homage to Lama Tsongkhapa, in his mantra or his prayer, there's this line, in this case referring to Avalokiteshvara, but it says, Avalokiteshvara, great treasure of compassion, not aimed at true existence. Right? Great treasure of compassion, not aimed at true existence. It's getting at the same idea. So here, and the way it says it in Chandrakirti's actual text, in the translation, is homage to compassion. And here, actually, they in the commentary, they differentiate 2 different things, actually. With the evanescent, right? So actually, maybe I'll go into this. So with the evanescent one, the image that we focus on is there's a reflection of the moon, right? And the wind is blowing. So there's shimmering. It's like, what's the word? Not just shimmering, but it's, what would be the word for that when there's ripples? Like it's moving, right? The ripples going through it. And so you see it's utterly impermanent, right? There's nothing, like if we look at the actual moon, we feel like there's something permanent there, right? It's stone or something. Like, but when you look at the ripples of the reflection of the moon, you can see, it's changing every instant. So that's the evanescent one. That's the second. The third one, actually, in the text they say, empty of inherent existence. That's the phrase that Chandrakirti uses. But they use a different image here. They actually use the moon itself now, the image, the reflection of the moon. Forget the evanescence for the moon. What they say is, empty of inherent existence, they use that metaphor in this way. They would say, when you look at the reflection of the moon, right? First of all, like if somebody just said, oh look, like somebody might say, let's say that we were at a lake, right, and it was nighttime, so I say, oh look, the moon, right? Somebody might say that. You say, oh wow, how pretty, But then this is the empty of inherent existence, right? That's what it says. So there's the appearance of the moon. Nobody would debate, right? When you see the reflection of the moon, like, so it's night and you're, whatever, it's a full moon and you see it reflected there in the lake, right? You would say, oh, the moon, right? And you would say, oh, look, it's definitely appearing there and it's quite beautiful, you might say. Right? But then you have to stop and say, well, is the moon there? Right? Or is this a moon appearing to my my eyes? But they say, if I search there, of course I won't find the moon, right? If I reach down and try to grab that moon, my hand will just get wet, right? And so what they say is there's the appearance of the moon there, right, which is clearly true, and yet there's no moon there in the lake, right? And no matter how much I search that lake, like if I were to dive in and swim around, or I were to drain the lake looking for the moon, no matter what, I'll never find a moon in the lake, right? And so, in that sense, the metaphor here, or the image here, is that the moon appears, but there's no, it definitely does appear, but it's not, there's nothing findable there, right? So in that sense, it's empty of inherent existence. It's empty of existing from its own side, right? There's the appearance to me of the moon, but there's no moon there from its own side, right? And so that's the point here. So in other words, just like that, sentient beings appear, right, and they're suffering, so this makes it compassion, but they lack any true existence or inherent existence from their own side. That's the meaning of that metaphor. That just like the moon appears but is not there from its own side, we sentient beings appear but are empty from our own side.
But but the basis of that appearance, there is something which is undescribable, but it is there, but we are looking at wrong place. But the whole point is. But another follow-up question is that as you mentioned, this whole text is based on this foundation of compassion, and when you mentioned this 3 compassion, and then it leads towards this 10 bhumis. So this 3 compassion, I can see that when you are in that compassion first part, when you bucket, then you mention about this first bhumi of joyfulness, and second and third. So how do they branch out in perfecting to have our view or understanding evolve from one and then?
I think the idea is that, at the beginning of our practice, right, for most of us at least, maybe there's some exceptions, but I think for most of us, we begin with the first type of compassion, right? In other words, we begin with compassion observing sentient beings. That's what they say. Compassion observing sentient. In other words, because if you think of an ordinary person, any of us, right, ordinarily, right? In other words, you see somebody suffering, right, and then you feel so maybe it's my friend is sick, right, and I feel deep empathy for them, I feel compassion for them, I want them to get better, right? That's normal everyday life, right? Or somebody loses someone they love and we feel compassion, right? That's all compassion observing sentient beings, right? And so ordinarily that's where we begin our practice, of course, right? Even in the Lam Rim, if you study that, right, whereas it teaches the stages of the path to enlightenment, most of those all those practices actually at the beginning for initially generating bodhicitta focus on mostly compassion observing sentient beings, right? So it's thinking of sentient beings as one's mother, or thinking of how other sentient beings want to be happy and don't want to suffer, getting empathy for their suffering and so on, and recognizing suffering, all the different kinds of suffering that sentient beings go through, and thinking about those topics. That's all compassion observing sentient beings. So I think ordinarily a practitioner begins there, of course, and that's why I think Chandrakirti mentions it first. That's what I thought on that. But then, as one is progressing along the path in terms of practice, right? So after having generated bodhicitta at this point, but if the person is then meditating, for example, extensively on impermanence, right? So they would take that only the second kind of compassion, the compassion observing phenomena as evanescent. Right? That only comes, I think, later when the person is meditating extensively on the momentary. I almost don't even want to say impermanence, because impermanence can imply still, well, we know everybody's going to die someday. This is a more subtle impermanence, right? It's the impermanence of the evanescence of things. Right? And so the idea is that the bodhisattva who is already, I think on a practical level, the bodhisattva who has already generated great compassion, then when they meditate on the evanescence, that's why I give that example of Lama Zopa in the cave or so, right? Whereas they've already generated this great compassion, and then as they're meditating on the evanescence, And this is, I think, an important distinction. Somebody who doesn't have great compassion, who also could meditate on evanescence, right, on that subtle impermanence, they would realize subtle impermanence, right? They might realize my body is changing instant to instant, right? And they would have a correct understanding of that, but it wouldn't give rise to the same kind of compassion, right? Whereas, because the Bodhisattva, as they meditate on that evanescence, then they look out at sentient beings, right? That's what Lama Zopa was getting at. They look at separate, and they see, oh wow, like, look how much beings suffer for grasping at permanence, and everything is changing instant to instant. It's like trying to grasp water, right? Like they're trying to hold on to water. Like they're trying to hold on to things that inevitably slip through their fingers. So when they meditate on impermanence, in this sense, on the subtle impermanence of evanescence, that gives rise to that second kind of compassion for them. Right? And then the third kind, the compassion observing the unapprehendable, right? Or the compassion observing the things are empty of inherent existence, like a reflection, in that sense. You know, I think, you know, that, I'm you know, sort of hesitant because I want to make sure this is correct, but I think it's reasonable to say that kind of compassion. I mean, you know, intellectually one may sort of think about that at any point. But I think, you know, if you think about the bodhisattvas who are dwelling on these grounds, for example, they've already realized emptiness, right? So when they look at sentient beings, they have that kind of compassion. I think you could say mainly that's the kind of compassion they have. Because they've already realized emptiness, right? So and then when they look at sentient beings, they no longer, they have the appearance, actually this is an important distinction it's a little philosophical for them. But a bodhisattva who's on the bhumis, right, has realized emptiness directly. So when that person meditates on emptiness itself in a direct way, only emptiness is appearing to their mind. They're in a kind of meditative absorption on the ultimate nature of reality. But when they come out of that meditative absorption, they again observe interdependence, right? They observe the interrelatedness, dependently arisen phenomena, including all sentient beings, right? But that bodhisattva, at that point, because they've realized emptiness directly, they no longer grasp at that inherent existence. It appears as though, it still appears to them as though beings have their own inherent existence, actually, once they're out of meditative absorption. But they no longer believe that appearance, actually, because they know it's false from their own experience. Does that make sense? So they have the appearance as if things exist inherently, but they don't believe that appearance. So for them, when they generate compassion, it would be this third kind. A compassion that understands the lack of inherent existence of the person they're having compassion for. And that bodhisattva then will recognize, that bodhisattva who's realized emptiness will recognize, oh, this sentient being doesn't even know that they're empty of inherent existence. Right? And so they may kill people, they may steal from people, they fight, they do all kinds of things because they think they exist inherently. And the bodhisattva recognizes, I see them as existing inherently, but I know they don't. I don't even believe that appearance. But they do, and based on that false appearance, they do all kinds of bad karma, and they suffer. And so that, I think that kind of, that third one, you know, would mainly, I think, I don't know if there's somebody on the path of preparation who you could say maybe has that to some degree, but I think mainly the bodhisattvas and the bhumis, that's their experience of sentient beings, right? Whereas they have this great compassion, but they know beings lack inherent existence. So I think it refers to some degree to different levels of the path.
So, Dr. Lawrence, so my understanding, limited understanding actually, would be that object remains the same in that it's the other sentient beings, but the view differs at different levels. And the way the view differs is basically subjective. Subjective in a sense, how does your mind perceive it? At an emptiness level would be the third compassion. The first and the second would be, the first would be just probably a conventional level, looking at migrators in samsaric level, and how can I help them, and so on and so forth. The second one probably will come in where you have some sort of realization of impermanence and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally that is part of it. But the object always remains sentient with other people. The subject is the awareness, the mind, the view.
Yeah, I agree. I was just trying to double check. I think that's pretty much, I don't think there's, I mean, Lama Tsongkhapa goes into a lot more detail. But his main focus is how it's compassion that gives rise to bodhisattvas, that gives rise to Buddhas. He's emphasizing that point in that section. But I think that's correct.
So in a nutshell, this compassion, this ground of compassion and this understanding is the middle way. It's like between the annihilism and eternalism, this understanding neither, so it's like neither nihilism and neither eternalism. This understanding is the middle way, while not refuting either one of them, like neither. So it's like, it's very interesting when this is the actual middle way, not the middle way like completely rich or poor and
Right.
not a middle class. No, that's
Right.
the conventional way we
Yeah,
think
yeah.
of.
No, this is not that middle way. I mean, the Buddha taught that also, right? Not to be, but not to do too extreme. But this is not that referring to that middle way. This is referring to the middle way between the extremes. Yeah, of they sometimes say between like adding, it's like what do we say? Not taking away what actually exists, right? But also not adding anything extra onto what actually exists. Like so, if we add something on, then we're getting into eternalism, right? That things somehow exist independently, or exist from their own side, or exist. On the other hand, if we say nothing exists, right, nihilism, then that's also wrong. We've taken away. They say something's called deprecating. In other words, we've actually tried. Like we're wrong in the sense that we're denying the existence of something that's actually true. And of course, there's an appearance. Of course, things that happen. Right, there are experiences, and to say nothing exists at all would be a kind of sort of nihilism. But it would be deprecating. That's a translation of a term. Deprecating in the sense of like saying there's less than what's actually there, and that's wrong. So it's a middle way between those two extremes. Yeah, so is that kind of what you were saying? Yeah. So it's a much subtler middle way than the other. But the other middle way is easier to understand. This middle way is much subtler to understand correctly. And in a way, the main topic of Chandrakirti's text is exactly what is that middle way. And he gets at very subtle points that people misunderstand that middle way. So he gets subtler and subtler as the text goes on, in a way, into how people could misunderstand what the meaning of the middle way is. And he gets into even some very deep philosophers who are very profound philosophers, but who misunderstood some small part of what the middle way actually is. And he's helping. He's trying to help them. He's saying, he's not saying in these words, but basically saying like, in this, he'll look at some other, he doesn't mention them by name, but you can see he's referring back to other people saying, sometimes people want to grasp at something, basically, right? And so they say, well, this exists independently, this exists from its own, and then he says, but then they're doing the eternalism, and they're doing it in a very subtle way, but it's wrong. It's actually, they're still grasping at something, and therefore they're going to stay in samsara. They have to learn to even let go of that, or even refute the existence of something that they're trying to hold on to feel, because it's an old habit or something. Anyway, I'm adding words onto the chapter here too.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
So that's where I think, I know you skipped that part of links of dependent origination. That's where I think probably that becomes the crux where he would help them.
Yeah, and he's going to give a lot, especially this is where I didn't go into too much, because really in chapter 6, Chandrakirti goes into great detail about different ways of meditating on emptiness and dependent origination. Because there's the main point, in a sense, is that dependent origination is the ultimate way or most profound way of understanding emptiness, and emptiness is not something different from an understanding of dependent origination, actually. So you're correct. It's through understanding dependent origination that one understands emptiness, and it's through understanding emptiness that one really understands dependent origination. And that's mentioned in other chapters, but he goes into great detail on that in the 6th chapter. So that's right. And that's why I didn't go into too much detail on it. It's covered in the section that is quite later, quite a bit later in the text. Well, actually, in that context, since we're talking about emptiness, maybe I'll mention one point about that Chandrakirti actually mentions quite a bit early on in the text. That's related. It's not, I mean, he covers many points about that in chapter 6, but in chapter 1, he gets at a certain point, which I wanted to bring up. I want to be sure to emphasize this, because I think it's related, and it transitions between all the chapters. So one way that, one point that Chandrakirti makes, maybe I'll say that too. Where is it? Oh, okay. So one point I was saying, you say this 6 or 10 perfections, right? And then I said in Sanskrit they're paramitas, right? And so para means the other side or the farther side, and ita is gone. So there's you could say sometimes they're practices that take one to the other side, right? Or they're practices that you could say they're, sometimes people translate as perfections. One person, somebody translates perfectionizers, like things that make, things that transmute one into a Buddha, in that sense. But you can say, put it simply, they're practices that take one to the other side, right? To take one from samsara to Buddhahood. And one way of defining, so go back to the perfection of generosity, for example, right? Paramita of generosity. And this I think Kenshin will get into, I'm sure, because he's going to cover chapter 1 a lot. Start with there. So what makes, because there's all, like Chandrakirti makes a couple points that are quite important actually, and it's going to relate to dependent origination and emptiness. And so one point he makes is generosity, right? Let me start with the perfection of generosity. So he makes this point. First of all, generosity is a good idea, right? It's a good thing to practice, right? And then he makes some points actually about that. He says, and it's related also to this point about the 3 types of compassion. It's related to that even that you were asking about. So that's why I wanted to come back to it. But it's a kind of on a very practical level. So Chandrakirti kind of, if you read this section on generosity in the text that I sent around, actually I'll read one line here because he's mainly talking about, right, the main topic is the practice of generosity of somebody on the first bhumi, on the first ground, right, who's a great bodhisattva who's seen emptiness directly. And so he starts there, but then he goes backwards for a moment, and he makes a point, he says, even for beings with little compassion, brutal, and intent on only their own aims, desired resources, right, what they want, ultimately arises from giving, from generosity, and causes the extinguishment of their suffering. So he's saying, I'm mainly addressing here bodhisattvas on the first ground, right, and he says, those kinds of bodhisattvas, basically joyfully even give away their own flesh, their eyes, their whatever, their own bodies. So he's saying, there's a sublime level of giving for the bodhisattva on the first ground. But then he's saying, even for beings like us, who are brutal, and intent upon only their own aims, or even for selfish beings, he's saying, even for somebody who's selfish, you have to practice generosity, right? Or you won't be happy. And so he's saying, and there's all this current research that Dalai Lama's encouraged, right? We're saying they do research showing that scientifically, right? People who are generous live longer and are more happy. He's saying that's his point is even if you're not a bodhisattva, right? Even if you're some selfish, violent kind of person, you should still learn how to be more generous because it's going to benefit you. Does that make sense? It's going to help you have less suffering and have more happiness and have more resources. And then he says, and if you practice giving enough, if you're a brutal person like that, if you practice giving enough, then gradually you'll have enough merit, you'll have enough good karma, that you'll come across a superior being. Means an Arya, somebody who's seen emptiness directly themselves. And through that meeting with them, they'll explain the meaning of emptiness to you. And gradually you'll start progressing. Does that make sense? So he's saying, he's giving advice to people like us, who from his perspective, are childish, brutal, right? Or his non-bodhisattvas, right? And he's saying, and I feel certain that Kenshin Rinpoche will emphasize these points because, he's teaching speaking mainly to non-Aryas, right, to people who have not seen emptiness directly. Maybe some people in the audience are exceptions, but mostly. So what he's saying here, right, is that for ordinary people, right, for ordinary people who are, remember in the other text, what text are we covering recently, where it said, they call them childish, right, many texts call ordinary people childish beings, right. He uses a different phrase, he's brutal and intent on their own aims, right? Which, like, from a bodhisattva's point of view is like, oh, you know, what's the word, like, it'd be like, you know, what's the word, like if you went out to a fancy restaurant, you saw somebody playing with their poop, right, you would say, oh, a fancy restaurant, it's disgusting. That's how they look at ordinary, when they look at selfish beings, they kind of look like that, like, oh, like, you know, they don't do that because they have compassion, but it's like horrifying, right, because the being's creating their own suffering, right. So here, Chandrakirti, what's that?
I said, where's that example?
I'm not sure.
Just kidding.
Creative. So here Chandrakirti is making a point. He's going to make this over and over again for each of the perfections, each of the paramitas. Is he saying, you know, if you're not a bodhisattva, he's recognizing some among the readers of his book might not be great bodhisattvas. That's possible, right? He's aware of that. And so he's saying, even if you're not a great bodhisattva, for your own sake, practice generosity, right? It'll help you suffer less. It'll help you have resources. It'll help you connect to great beings, to great spiritual beings. And therefore, through that connection to them, you'll progress on your path and you'll eventually become such a spiritual being yourself. So he's saying, so if you're just like an ordinary person, right, like who's brutal, please do that for your own sake. Right? But then he's going back. Each one he does this. So he talks about for ordinary beings, and then he switches back to for these great bodhisattvas who are on the bhumi. Right? And then he makes a point, which I think is an important one to raise, which is, so what differentiate, you know, in other words, I'll ask, just like you have to think about this, like, so let's say generosity, right, like, so there is, if you have a heart of generosity and you give something, is that a paramita? And part of, I think, what's usually the way that's explained is no, right? Like, whereas any generosity is good karma, right? If you're doing genuine generosity, right, then that's good karma, and that's a positive thing to do. But for something to become a paramita, right, something that's leading a being to Buddhahood, right, there are 2 points I think that are worth mentioning. One is, it has to be conjoined with bodhicitta, right? Whereas remember in, like, Shantideva says, in his text, ordinary virtues are like a, what's the word, he said plantain tree, but I sometimes say like an annual, right? An annual flower, right? It flowers once and then it dies, right? And it doesn't come back next year. Right? Whereas virtues done with bodhicitta are like perennials, right? They flower forever. They continue flowering. You know? And so Shantideva makes this point that a virtue, like generosity, that's done without bodhicitta will bring a good result, and then it will be extinguished. Right? Whereas a virtue that's done with bodhicitta motivation will continue to bring good results up until you become a Buddha, and then will contribute to your Buddha activity in the future for the benefit of others. So it's an eternal benefit. That's one point. And then Chandrakirti gets into something else, which this is the point I was actually leading to. He says also, the Bodhisattva conjoins their practice of generosity in this first case with some understanding of emptiness. And I want to explain what he says. I want to share what he says, because I think this is usually an important part of the whole text. So here, I'll pick up here. I'm going to read a little bit of what Chandrakirti says and then explain. So I'm getting to, there's a verse that's transitional between ordinary beings and these bodhisattvas. Okay? So he says, those bearing in mind a promise to help beings, right? So that's the Bodhisattva vow, right? He's referring there to Bodhisattva, like to the Bodhisattva vow, right? So to help beings attain happiness from giving before too long, right? So what he's saying is, all beings have to practice generosity to be happy, right? That's the path to happiness. Then he says, for those merciful, right? So for those who are compassionate, and for those not so, right? And for the not compassionate, only a discourse on giving is therefore chief. Right? So he's saying from his perspective, from the perspective of the teacher, it being himself, I guess, in this case, or the Buddha. Probably referring to the Buddha, I guess. But he's saying, whether you're trying to benefit ordinary selfish beings or you're trying to help bodhisattvas progress on the path, both need to understand generosity. And then he says, whereas when a conqueror's child, meaning a bodhisattva, right, hears and thinks of the word give, happiness arises. Isn't that a beautiful description? Right? For a bodhisattva, even the word happiness, even the word give makes them happy. The subduers, abiding in peace, have no such happiness. What need is there to mention the joy of giving all? Right? Through his own suffering, now he's describing these bodhisattvas, through his own suffering in cutting and giving away his body, he sees with knowledge others' pain, in hells and so forth, and strives quickly to eliminate their suffering. So here he's describing great bodhisattvas who can happily give away their own body. They're so joyful to give away their bodies to benefit others who are in hell. Right? And now he's getting to the point I was getting to. He says, giving void of gift, giver, and receiver is called supermundane perfection. When attachment to those three is produced, it's called mundane perfection. So that was the point I was getting to. And so what he's saying there is, if you give, and this is getting at the same point about the unapprehendable. Remember we were talking about that earlier, that you asked about the unapprehendable kind of compassion. So what he's saying is, for somebody who grasps at an inherently existent giver, gift, and receiver, their practice is a mundane perfection. Right? It's mundane, it's not transcendental. Then he's saying, the supramundane perfection, the person is practicing giving while being aware of the voidness, of the emptiness of the giver, the gift, and the receiver. Okay. Is that, at least the words make sense? It's a hard concept now. There, what he's getting at is what's sometimes called the emptiness of the three spheres. So it's they sometimes say and I'm going to actually read what I wrote out. It says, it refers to the dependent relationship and emptiness of the agent, the action, and the object of an action. So just let's contemplate that for a moment, right? So, and this is experiential. So like in other words, so if you think of like giving somebody something, right? Imagine you're giving somebody food or money or something, right? Ordinarily, right, for ordinary people, ordinarily, it's a mundane practice, right? Whereas the sense of, this is, so I'm thinking, oh, I'm perceiving myself, right, as intrinsically, inherently existent, of the money as inherently existent, and of the person I'm giving it to as inherently existent, right? And the act of giving it to all of those, actually, right? I'm perceiving the whole process as inherently existent. The gift, the giver, and the receiver in particular. And then, here, right, for it to be a transcendental or supermundane, translator says, a perfection. So that bodhisattva, right, is aware of what? So think about it for a moment, right? Whereas I say, oh, this is me, like if I'm giving Mike something, right? I feel, this is me, I'm the giver, Mike's the receiver, and I'm giving him a pen or something, right? So here we contemplate though, like, in what sense am I a giver? Like, whereas as soon as I say giver, right, the sense or the perception of inherent existence infects my perception, right? So I feel, yeah, I'm the giver, right? Like if somebody were to say to me, as I'm giving Mike, if I gave Mike, well, maybe I would. If I gave Mike my favorite object, right? Imagine this for a moment. Imagine you gave somebody your car, right? Like something quite significant, and then somebody said you didn't give them anything, right? What's that?
I didn't hear that.
And then somebody said you didn't give them anything, right? You might get quite offended. Like, what are you talking about? I didn't give them anything. I just gave them my car. That was a big deal, right? There would be some feeling like that, right? Because I'm perceiving and inherently that I'm the giver, right? What do you mean? Don't you see it? I gave, you know, and like even like experience like I noticed that myself one time, like, you know, because nowadays, right? If I went online to give to some like a political, you know, and then you get all these emails, right? Like, give, and I'm like, and this feeling arises, I already gave. You know, there's a feeling arose in myself, right? I already gave. How do you not know? You know, like, you know, why are you asking me for more right now? I just gave like 2 weeks ago. You know, and it's this feeling of like, I'm the giver, right? That was the feeling that arose at that point for me, right? When I got the third email or something, I'm like, hey, wait a second, I already gave. I'm a giver. You know, why are you asking me again? Like, so that's the perception of an inherently existent giver, right? What Chandrakirti is saying here is, in what sense are you a giver, right? And he's not saying there's no giver. He's encouraging people to practice generosity, right? But he's pointing out dependent origination. In other words, you're only so the giver is only a giver relationally and dependently upon the receiver. Obviously, right? You are, you know, it's like so I can't be a giver. Let's say this right. Inherently, there's not like a findable giverness in me, right? Because my being able to label myself as giving is dependent upon the other and the object given, right? Whereas if I say I gave something but I had nothing to give and therefore I didn't, you know, like it's not just dependent on the other, because like if I say, you know, I don't know, if I were to say, you know, Mike, here's $1 million, and I give him nothing, then I didn't actually give, right? I pretended to give, but I didn't give. So it's dependent upon the object given also. Does that make sense? So in dependence upon those things, we label. We say, oh, okay, that's the giver, and that's the receiver, and that's what's given, right? And then, like, you know, do you ever think about this, right? I was saying this, I think, last time a little bit, like, because it came up in a different context, but, like, so if I give somebody a $100 bill, right? Like, it's a bit funny, right? Because, like, so then we say that $100 bill was a gift, right? But actually, like, then if that person spends that $100 bill at the grocery store, right? And then they deposit it in the bank, and then the bank gives it to somebody 2 weeks later who goes to the teller, is that $100 bill still a gift? When the person takes it from the teller, right, they say, here's my withdrawal slip, right, and then they receive the whatever, and they take it and they put it in their cash register, let's say at their place where they work, right, like, and then there's this, like a few hundreds in the stack, whatever, the cash register. Now is that $100, like that piece of paper, is that a gift at that time? Right, so like, whereas it's not a gift from its own side, is it? Right, we can label it a gift. At the moment where I'm handing it to somebody, if I want to label that and say, oh, this is a gift, right? But actually, you can't, like, there's nothing in that piece of paper that makes it a gift, is there? Right? Otherwise, it would stay a gift, you know, like, so actually then you could go into the store and say, oh, that's my gift, thank you, you know, I'll take it out of your cash register, then you'll get arrested, right? Because it's not a gift from its own side, right? You know, and, you know, if I were intrinsically a giver, then I'd, like, actually, then every time I got those emails, I would automatically be sending money, right? If I were inherently a giver, then, you know, there would always be, whatever, then the political candidate or whoever would always be getting money every second from me, right? But that's not the case, is it? So, I'm not actually, right? There is no gift that's a gift from its own side. And there's no recipient who's a recipient from their own side. And there's no giver who's a giver from their own side. But relationally, right, dependently upon each other, we can say, we can talk about generosity. Does that make sense? So Chandrakirti is saying, the bodhisattva who's practicing a super mundane perfection is aware of that as they're practicing giving. Does that make sense? So he's saying any kind of generosity is better than not being generous. So he's saying if you're not capable of that, still be generous. Good. Like you can see Chandrakirti clearly saying that. If you're not capable of practicing a super mundane perfection, then still practice generosity because it will help you. That's what he's saying, right? It'll help you become happier over time. But then he's saying if you really want to, if you want to practice the Bodhisattva path, then we have to train ourselves, right, and become somebody capable of being giving while being aware, right, that giver, gift, and receiver, go back, right, empty of the three spheres, right? Each is empty, right? In other words, it's also funny, right? Like in other words, if I were intrinsically the giver and this other person were intrinsically the receiver, right, then I would never receive. Right? But that's not true, is it? Right? Sometimes I receive. There are many ways to see this point, right? This is not as subtle as some of the later ways that Chandrakirti addresses this question of emptiness. But he's getting at the point of mutual dependence. Does that make sense? That giver, gift, and receiver are mutually dependent and therefore are not, don't exist inherently as they appear. Does that make sense there? Okay. And so one thing Chandrakirti does then is as he goes on through the text, he does that same kind of analysis for each of the perfections, right? Describing the emptiness of the three spheres. Actually, I don't know if he does it in the later chapters, but he does it in the early chapters quite a bit.
Actually, he does it everywhere.
I can't remember in the last, after the 6th chapter, I can't remember if he
Up
does
to
it.
5 he does.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I don't remember if chapter 8 or 9. I could check that with you, but I just don't recall. I think he probably does, but some of those later chapters were extremely brief. That's why I hesitated. But anyway, you get this idea though of the emptiness of the three spheres. That's just extremely important to understand. First of all, and to understand Chandrakirti's text is important. But secondly, the idea is that as we practice, this is something I think we can actually put into practice, right? First of all, we can put into practice recognizing, for example, that going to the first two perfections, generosity and ethics, right? Those are things we all have to practice. Right? We all have to practice trying to, grow in our capacity for generosity and for being ethical. Right? So that's the first point. Then the second point is, if we can conjoin that with bodhicitta, first of all, right, with the wish to become enlightened for the welfare of other sentient beings, and then also if we can join it with an awareness, which is possible, right? In other words, so if you're gonna, and this is a practice, so I'm just suggesting it, so if you're gonna, because we do these things, right? So if you're gonna go and give somebody a gift, or if you're gonna, nowadays, right, people go, you go to your computer oftentimes, right? You'll sort of be, you have to type in all that information, right? That you're gonna send a gift to some person or organization, right? Via
There's a button called donate.
PayPal, donate, all these things, right? Whatever, there are all these different ways. You may use your credit card or your bank or your online bill pay, whatever. But if you were going to practice what Chandrakirti is saying, right, then what you would do is you would sit there first and meditate, right? So you would sit in front of your computer rather than just going through and clicking all the buttons. You would meditate. You would think, okay, first of all, although this is, whatever, I'm giving this particular thing to this particular cause or whatever, my motivation, first of all, is compassion, right? Is bodhicitta, the wish to become enlightened in order to lead all sentient beings from suffering, right? So may I lead these, may I help in this small way right now, but may it lead me to eventually become capable of benefiting all sentient beings as vast as the vastness of space through love and compassion for all beings, right? So I'm practicing generosity for that motive, right? But then you have to and you would also pause, and you would meditate on the emptiness of the three spheres, right? So you would say, you would meditate. So is there an inherently existent giver and recipient and gift? And am I perceiving them as inherently existent, right? And do I understand that they're not, that they're mutually dependent, right? And therefore empty of inherent or intrinsic existence. And you would meditate on that, right? And then as he says, then you would, if you're cultivating bodhicitta, then you would feel some sense of joy, right? Like, oh, how fun. Like now I get to, with bodhicitta, offer something to somebody with an awareness of the emptiness of the three spheres, right? And then you can hit send or whatever, or donate. Then you could approve or whatever the button would say, right? I could do it in real life, where you're handing somebody something, or you could do it online, whatever. But you could, it's actually, I guess what I'm pointing out is, you know, if you're in the middle of like, it's actually easier nowadays, right? Like, because if you're like walking downtown DC, and you're gonna like help somebody with something, right? Or it's actually harder to pause, like, because we're not very good at meditating on emptiness, most of us. It'd be hard to actually meditate on emptiness effectively, you know, while you're interacting and talking to somebody and moving through a crowd or something. It's much harder, actually. But if you're doing it, like nowadays, I'm just pointing out, right, on a practical level, since there is this opportunity, right, sometimes we do that in front of a computer, well, then you can stop and meditate, right? So it's easier to practice the emptiness of three spheres in that way. Eventually, the goal is, of course, as he says, to be able to do it in all contexts, and while giving, you know, he says, even while giving up, you know, parts of one's body, ultimately, things like that, you know, so, he's saying, you know, like organ donation or whatever, things like that, right? But he's saying we can start where we are.
So sometimes you come into a situation where intellectually you process that maybe it's not the right thing to give at this moment, but then you also feel, who are you to decide that? And after the fact, you might feel like you're miserly in not doing what you were supposed to do. How do you negotiate with those sort of things?
You know, I think you're raising, like, do people understand the question? Did everybody hear the question? Oh, maybe say it again, or do you want to?
So, for example, I was at a grocery store the other day, and there was a pregnant lady. She came up to me and she said, "I don't have money. Can you pay for my car?" And so my next question to her was to probe more. And I don't know if it was right or wrong. I asked, "Where's your car?" And she said, "My car is the back." I said, "I want to see it." I'm being judicious in that, meaning, am I giving it to the right person? I know you're pregnant, you're approaching me for money. And so she said, it's in the back, you can come with me. And I said, no, I'm in a rush because I have to get back to a meeting. So I said, I can give you some money, I don't have time to look at the card right now, will you accept it? She was like, she gave a couple of dubious sort of answers, and it made me feel like probably it's not the right thing for me to do. So I decided against it. But when I was contemplating about that, it came to mind saying, hey, you should have given it. So how do you deal with such situations?
It's an interesting question, right? Like, it's very practical. One is I guess I'll say this, like, I think, actually, I'm pausing because I've been contemplating that question. A few weeks ago, I spent quite a bit of time contemplating real examples of that question. Like, and what I was noticing from my own experience was, like, I could think back to years ago. Like, just to be honest, like, in relation to what you're saying, I was meditating on purification, right? And I was of karma, and I was able to think back. I was like going, wow, like I can remember a time, you know, like years ago, right? Where I bumped into somebody somewhere I never met before, and they asked me for something, and it felt off to me some way or other, and I said no. And I was like, wow, and I'm still, in my heart, I'm still bothered, actually. Like, I was sitting meditating, I was like just trying to be with my own experience of that, and I was like, wow, that was years ago, and I still feel bad. And I was like thinking, and I was like even though I think looking back, I was like, from my own experience, I was like going, I don't think I was wrong. Like, I think something was off. Like, I correctly sensed something was off in that interaction with that person. I felt maybe weird, or just like something felt wrong. And so I wanted to get away from them, actually, right? With some feeling in me, and so I either, so I somehow avoided the situation or did something. But I was like, now it's 5 years later and I'm still feeling weird. If I'm honest with myself in my own heart, I feel
That's true.
closed-hearted is the experience, actually. I feel like I was like, if I meditate on that moment, the experience in me is some kind of closed-heartedness. And I actually thought about it, I thought, wow, I've spent money over the last 5 years on all kinds of stupid things that were totally a waste, like had no meaning at all, that didn't bring me much happiness, and this is causing me suffering. I was like, and I was going back to just selfishly, like forget about the other person for a moment. Selfishly, it would have been a much better use of my money to give it to them. Was like my first point when I was meditating on it for myself. I was like, that would have been a much better investment of like that money, And then I was like, and do I know what they would have done with it? I'm like, I don't know. Actually, I don't really know. I didn't know the person. And so I guess that I'm just sharing one this is my own experience. That's not telling you what to do, but that was one reflection I had. And then another reflection I had is like, so there's this teaching. Then this is where I went on. I was sitting and meditating. I'm sharing my own process. So I was thinking, okay, but then there's another kind of problem, which is like, how to say it right? When you give, which I've also experienced, like where I give too much to somebody, too much being subjectively. There's no objective measure of too much, as we said, it's dependent. Right? But too much for me in the sense that then I felt resentful and angry at the person because I felt like they were misusing it and being manipulative or being, and that also felt bad, right? And so I was like, oh wow, how do you find, like I was like, and the idea, and then I was like thinking of bodhisattvas actually, right? So these stories of bodhisattvas where like somebody unreasonably asked for their eyeballs or something, there's like these famous stories in sutras, and I'm like, well, and of course they're on the first bhumi usually, right? They're perfecting the generosity, so they're like, oh great, I get to give up my eyeballs. At that level, the bodhisattva, their experience of their body is like our experience of a piece of cloth or something, so it's like, so I was just like meditating on this, I was like going, so it depends where you're at, right? Like, because the idea the idea, I guess, is this, is if you give, there's a teaching that says this, if you give and then you deeply regret it, that's bad karma. On the other hand, like, if somebody asks you for help and you feel averse to them and you don't help them, right, that goes against the bodhisattva vows, actually, right, to help all beings. And so the trick is, that I was realizing, is like, one has to find one's own, like, right level, where you're giving, but it's just short. And I guess, this is my own personal reflection. What I finally came to, I was like, okay, so you have to, like, find your limit, where you would regret it and feel resentful, right? And then say just below that, and try to keep raising that level. And I was like, that would be the practice of a bodhisattva then, I think. That's my own reflection on it. It's like, because if you just say, oh, that's my level, so I'll always give that much and I'll never change it, well, then you're not progressing, right? On your own inner practice. And that's the other thing I was reflecting on, is like, how do I say it right? Like, because there is a level on which, in other words, if you're going to regret it and feel manipulated and feel, that's not helping. That's negative karma. But if you're not, on the other hand, like, finding the ways to, and one last point I'll make is, the idea is that, there's just one, and then I'll say what you think, comment. But the other thing I thought of is that, like, because generosity is different than giving also, for what it's worth. Like, there is, like, because people could give and not be generous. Like, right, there is, you could give to manipulate somebody, you could give to get somebody to think a certain way of you, you could give, like, there are all the things that are giving, but generosity is, let's say it right, he described it, right, generosity has a wish for the other to be happy, right, a wish to, like, there's a open-heartedness, I'll call it, and so I think, let's say it right, the idea ultimately is not to sort of, so doing like a version of giving that makes one more and more resentful and, I don't know, like annoyed or something, that's not working, right? And for myself, the last point I'll make, like, because what I often reflect on is like, I'll be honest, I'm sharing my own personal reflection here for a moment, but my own like touchstone around this is I often think back to my grandfather when I was a kid, where he used to like, he loved to like take me places or do things with me, and I was always aware he was having at least as much fun, if not more fun than me, doing the activity. Like, you know, he'd say, oh, why don't we go show you alligator wrestler? So I don't know, it was like all these like weird things that he would think, and it was like, I was having fun, but I would like look at him and I'd be like, oh, he's having more fun giving this to me than I'm even having, or at least as much as I'm having doing it. And if I wasn't having that much fun, he would like get so overjoyed that I would start to go happy. And I was like, I always think back and I'm like, that's generosity, right? Like, that's the genuine spirit. And so it's like to cultivate that. Does that make sense? And then it's less about, you know, the other person in that sense too. It's more about the process of, it's about empathy for the other person. It's not disconnected in that way. But it's not about like, they have to do what I want. That's what I mean. Like, it's not with some spirit of like, I'll give it to them so that then they'll treat me with respect or think I'm so wonderful or tell people I'm something, you know, whatever. And that's not what you were getting at, but I'm just adding that. But sorry.
So I was just thinking about generosity, not really giving isn't the key. It's helping is the key. And you know, just being where we are in our lives, I think it's the doubting part, and doubting the years later, and I had that experience of have I given too much? Have I, you know, should I have helped that person? But that the key goes back to helping. Is this, if I give this person what they're asking for or anything at all, am I helping or am I not helping? And doubting that. But I think there's something, I mean, I can't remember where I read it, but I think there's something about the knowing inside of yourself and that hunch that you had or the hunch that Roger had of, you know, that feeling of if something's not right here, and then being able to trust that feeling that something was telling me that it wasn't right here, so I did the right thing by not giving. You know, or sometimes there's something not right here as I should have, even though I didn't know what it was. Was it that person, the way they looked, that was giving me that hunch, what was giving me that hunch, and it's just so hard to know.
So in Rajiv's scenario, if we came up with that same conclusion of saying, you know, I think something is amiss or something is not quite right, but with thinking that it's because it's going to harm the other person, but so it's less, the analysis is less, I might be harmed or they might misuse what I'm giving, but instead, how is it, if there's something wrong and that might harm the other person, and you come up with the same conclusion, won't that be then at least less of the I? I mean, you come up with a conclusion that says maybe it's not proper to give because it might harm that person, whatever.
Right.
You know, let's say you verified and decided it's, you know, this person is doing it to 10 other people. They have some bad intention. As long as you're not assuming. But that you did verify that they're doing this to 10 other people and that then therefore they're harming themselves, then isn't that more like the Bodhisattva way of thinking, that your reasoning is not your I, but the reasoning is that person. The reason that you're not able to give is because that person might harm themselves.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah, in other words, if you reasonably believe that, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, but my take on the situation was, this was spontaneous, right? I was not prepared for
Yeah.
this. And so I really understand that it's an act of karma. That I'm pretty sure about, right? But out of that, what do I, in my analytical reasoning, out of that, what do I get is, such situations can repeat itself over in the future as well. So now I'm programmed to think fastly about it. Oh, these situations might arise. So what would be my thought process for that? I thought about it. And then I figured out maybe you should take a step behind and think it differently than what you thought last time. So I'm going to improve myself a little better. So that was my reasoning on the incident. but having not helped, yes, I have a very bad feeling, like Dr. Lawrence said, and so this was an act of karma for me to think. That's how I look at it, because she would not have come across me spontaneously, like right across me like that, right on my face, if not for one reason. Does that make sense?
You have some karmic relationship
Yeah,
to her.
there was some karmic relationship, right? So what do I take out of that is, yes, I felt bad about it post the fact, but then I also think maybe next time you'll be better prepared for it, how to react to such situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm not refuting or supporting, I was just using your example.
Yeah, but then I am beyond using my intellectuality, where I'm gonna say, you know, I'm not going to use my smartness at that situation. Rather, I'm going to use my, I don't know what to say, my conscience at the situation.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Jeff, you had a comment.
Just 2 points. One, you get faced with this all the time. You have no choice but to use your own wisdom to make a determination what to do. The bad feelings or the good feelings or whatever. The other is that, you can be giving all the time, 100% of the time. You go online and give to one place, but there's a million places online that you could give to. They're all needy. They're all asking for your money. So we make discriminations all the time about when and where and how we can give, and there's no choice but to do that. There is a current scam going on in Nepal, which I just came back from, where a woman will come up to you with a baby in her arms, her breast exposed, saying she can't feed her baby, could we please give her some money for a formula? And the only reason I knew not to respond positively to that was Paula had the same experience, and it turns out they basically go buy the formula, they get a rebate from the store, and no formula goes to the baby. So you can never really tell what's going on. I mean, your heart goes out to a woman who's got the nerve to stand there like that, but it's just a scam. So then, what?
Or Nestle's. Sorry.
Or Nestle's what?
Nestle's,
Oh,
they're doing that.
could be their
With
scam.
decades.
Yeah. No, it's you always have to decide what you think is going on and make your determination. And the second guessing part, it's hard to deny that occurs, but you have no choice but to use your own wisdom to make a decision at that moment. That's my piece.
We live in a degenerate samsara. I mean, we accept that, but I don't know, maybe you're right.
I like what you said, that you said it's an opportunity to think, well,
Yeah,
how
I
can
can.
use my wisdom
I
better
can't get
next time?
anything.
Oh,
I
yeah.
can't get
That's
anything
cool.
other than that from that experience.
That's cool.
But being mindful about it and analytically looking at the situation, meditating upon it, I get like, maybe I could have given $10. That would have been my level. That's where I'm at in my life, right? Or $20. Could be that, like Dr. Lawrence said. But whatever it is, I would not felt as bad as I feel right now. So I would have taken care of my feelings, right? I don't know what would happen, how would it help the other person, but I would have felt better about that. That's how I look at it.
That was actually one, well, just to share, my own conclusion in that one, when I was doing that day, when I was doing my own meditation on examples, similar examples from the past. I guess one conclusion I came to myself, I had been reading the Bodhisattva vows, and they were describing these points about there's a relational quality, right? Like I was reflecting just on there was the part of it is like, part of what I was reflecting on is like, what they're getting at is that it's not for the person who's trying to practice the Bodhisattva's way of life, it's not just about, let's say it right. It's not just about the groceries or the formula it's about a relationship, right? Like where the intention is to lead the other person to Buddhahood, right? To enlightenment. And I was like reflecting on that. I was going, oh wow, that's what I was missing sometimes myself. You see that with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, if you've ever gone out with Lama Zopa Rinpoche somewhere, like a restaurant or something, where oftentimes like, you won't just leave a tip, right? It'll be like, gift and a 5 times the size tip and a personal letter to the person. You know, sometimes it'll be like this, like, and you get, oh, this is not, like, this is him creating a relationship, which over many lifetimes may flourish and leading that other person to Buddhahood or something. And so for my own reflection, I was like, I'm just showing my own process where I was meditating on that, and I sort of thought, oh, that's what I was sometimes missed, like and I was reflecting on, so if that's a practice, in other words, that's my own practice, if that's going to be part of my own practice, as Chandrakirti, for example, is suggesting, then I was like, oh, I was lazy then. Like, in other words, because there are times where I want to give somebody a lot, right? But there are times where something feels off. I was like, but part of it is I was like realizing I don't carry change, for example. I don't carry ones. I don't carry, and I was like, and that was what I started reflecting. I was like, well, even if I think the person's a scammer, I can give them. If I were trying to practice with that intention, then I would want to have a very small amount to give that person. Because I wouldn't want to participate in a scam, but I would also want to establish a virtuous relationship to the person. And so this is my own reflection. I was like going, and so I've been lazy. In other words, I don't really like having change in my pocket. I don't really like going to the bank and getting one, so I don't do it. And I was like, but if I'm going to practice the perfection of giving and try to do that, then it's worth the effort. Then it becomes meaningful to go to the bank or to go get change. And I was like going, oh, so I've been lazy. I wasn't doing that, but I could do that. That's easy. Like, in other words, I could make the effort. And so for me, it was like this, because then I could sort of have the option of, you know, if you feel like this is really something where giving a lot is helpful, then you can do that. But if it feels more like, well, I don't think they're actually doing something helpful, but I still want to establish that bodhisattva intentional relationship, then I have the option, whereas otherwise you don't have the option in the moment. That was what I was sort of reflecting on. And I was going, I had been lazy and not giving myself all the options in those moments. So that was my own reflection.
Sometimes the giving too is though from the heart. I know when my own experience in the past, I always, when I go into a city, I have a stash of ones in both pockets and a stash of ones in my cars for the people walking down the, you know.
It's because you're not lazy.
Well, no,
I think so.
because I've been hungry, I've been cold, you know what I mean? And or sometimes I don't really care if they're gonna go use it for alcohol, because what they want is a human to say, I see you, you know, and, or sometimes they just wanna go get a bus, whatever, but, but, some of the more meaningful exchanges I think that I've had are the people on the street that are sitting there just saying, you know, haven't eaten all day, and then saying, you know, well, come on in and have a meal with me, I'm hungry too. And that one's kind of mind-blowing for both parties, because, you know, that to spend time with somebody who feels no self-worth and feels like you see them with no self-worth, and to walk in and see the manager have, you know, the people, the experience of how people even just see that and take the time to recognize a human being, and to say to yourself, you know, do you think you're better than that person? You know, do you think you're any more worthwhile than that person? You know, you were given this money in the first place. It's to share. It's not to, you know, to keep. And those have been very meaningful experiences. And sometimes I'm extremely distrustful of people. I can't help it. You know, and it helps to look that in the face, you know, and kind of say, you know, what a jerk you would have been had you just walked past that person, you know. And sometimes I walk past them and I am that jerk, you know. But people need to be recognized, like an animal too. Sometimes they, you know, that's easy one for me, you know, to stop and you know, pet them and give them a little hug and just a moment of time, a moment of touch.
Yep.
Practicing of the emptiness. Can we say when you get perfection of the emptiness, so you will feel less affliction, because it will help you have a less attachment, so less affliction. So all that comes from your understand the selfless. There's no self. If you don't have no self, then everything is emptiness, because self is non-existent. So you won't have attachment, no affliction anymore. So can we say this is enlightenment, part of enlightenment? purpose of practicing the, instant of emptiness is go to enlightenment.
Yeah.
But how do you find you get to enlightenment? Because you don't have affliction, you don't have attachment, you don't have delusion.
So what's the question then?
The
Because that's
question
clear.
is the purpose of doing the practice of emptiness is you want to less affliction, less
Yeah.
attachment.
Mhm.
But this is the process to enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
But how do you know how much you have to practice?
How do you know how much you have to practice?
Yeah.
Well, usually they say.
Sometimes
You just know.
What's that?
sometimes you get extracted because you practice too much emptiness, you might feel you need to do nothing.
I hope Dr. Lauren is not gonna cry now.
It's empty of the inhibitors existence. So you want to do nothing because then you don't have any affliction, you don't have any attachments. Is that the way
Oh, I
to?
see. No, so part of what Chandrakirti, this is actually important. Like this is why going back to the earlier part, right? About Chandrakirti gave this three types of compassion, right? So part of what Chandrakirti is getting, I'm going to explain it in the context of something the Dalai Lama often says, right? So the Dalai Lama often points out, if you meditate on emptiness, right, then it will, if you meditate correctly on emptiness, right, it will undermine the mental afflictions, right? So your like pride and desire and anger and jealousy and all those, right? It will undermine those and they will decrease, right? But then part of what Chandrakirti here is saying is what the Dalai Lama points out, which is understanding emptiness doesn't decrease love and it doesn't decrease compassion. So if you're meditating correctly on emptiness, then your compassion will increase, actually. And so when Chandrakirti says, we call it compassion observing the unobservable, right, or perceiving the unobservable. There, right, there is like one's meditation on emptiness should actually make one's compassion stronger. And so then one will want to get up and be generous, right? Like in other words, so the idea is that if you meditate on emptiness correctly, you're right, you shouldn't want to get up and go cheat people or, gather more, practice greed or all that, right? Or be angry and hurt people. Emptiness should decrease those things. But actually this is why Chandrakirti, I think, is emphasizing the 10 perfections, is the idea is that if we're meditating correctly on emptiness, it actually should increase our passion and our energy. He says, right, even the word give it, like, so he's saying here, right, he says the Bodhisattva on the first bhumi, right, so this is somebody who's realized emptiness directly at that point, right, he says, that person, even if they hear the word generosity, they feel so excited and happy. So the idea is that if we're meditating correctly on emptiness, like the first bhumi, first level Bodhisattva, for example, here, that what he's saying, and they actually say that, right, if you like in the Sutra of Golden Light, there are some stories like that, where these bodhisattvas, one bodhisattva who's on the first bhumi at that time, the commentary they say is he was on the first bhumi, that like, just when he has the opportunity to give, right, he's like so excited, oh, I get to give now, oh, I've been looking for this opportunity, I can't wait to give. Like, so for that bodhisattva, when they're meditating on emptiness, of course when they're absorbed in emptiness, then they're absorbed in emptiness meditation. But then when they come out of that, as soon as they open their eyes, like, so to speak, like they're so, what does he say? Overjoyed, right, to practice giving and to practice, and then so on, and ethics and patience, right? And so those bodhisattvas then, like, they're meditating on emptiness, right? But then when they, like, are looking around, right, and somebody's like, let's say they see somebody very angry, right? For that bodhisattva, they're different than us, right? That bodhisattva looks and says, oh wow, like, the angry person is empty of inherent existence, I'm empty of inherent existence, and patience is empty of inherent existence. Let me go practice patience. This is great. And they go towards the angry person. They say, oh, how are you doing? And then the person gets, angry at them, and they think, oh, this is great. The inside, they're like, I get to practice patience now. I'm so lucky. So they're very passionate, even in a sense, about practicing the 6 perfections. And that's what Chandrakirti is saying, is that, you can join the understanding of emptiness with these practices of, so compassion, and then, generosity, ethics, patience, and so on. And so that's what the way it should work, is that one's understanding of emptiness should strengthen one's practice of those other practices, like patience and so on. And that the Bodhisattva, they say, is like happy to do that for even 3 countless great eons, right? The Bodhisattva feels, even if for 3 countless great eons I'm going to conjoin meditation on emptiness with these other practices to become a Buddha, then I feel happy to do that, you know, like, because that's the path to full enlightenment of Buddhahood for the welfare of all sentient beings out of Bodhichitta. So their motivation of Bodhichitta, like, is like an unstoppable force, actually, in a way, that causes them to go out and interact with others in compassionate ways. Does that make sense? I guess it's 12:30, so we should stop. But well, thanks everybody. You know, obviously, you know, for those who are interested, Ken Srimsky will teach a lot more on this, you know, and much better on this topic. This is just an introduction, but I hope. My main point is this: I hope that this like oriented people just a little bit. You know, there are a lot of other topics, and there'll be a handout for people who come with Ken Srimsky. There'll be some handouts and things like that. But you can get a start to get a sense. It's like this topic is like a whole ocean. Okay, so we'll just do the dedication. So Supreme Jewel, Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.